On Australia's energy crisis, the shocking power play behind your surging bills.
Unquestionably, power prices in Australia are too high.
If Dave wasn't working his second and third jobs, we probably wouldn't be making it.
If it goes up any more, it's going to knock me out.
We disconnect about 10,000 people a month.
Politicians are trying to make out that it's all under control. It's not under control.
This is an industry that ultimately has gouged its customers.
It's completely avoidable. This should never have happened to consumers. I think it's a shameful thing for Australia.
For many Australians, paying the power bill eats up more and more of the household budget. But why are we paying so much? We know that networks have overspent on poles and wires, and retailers have made millions with confusing and complex contracts. But in the first of a three-part series, 7:30 can reveal another reason: price gouging by the biggest players in the energy generation market. This story from Liz Hobday and producers Chris Gillette and Danny Tran.
Every day and every night, the vast majority of Australians are plugged in to the national grid, one of the biggest in the world. The power grid is under pressure. So how did we get here? And how are we going to keep the lights on?
We are undoubtedly in the midst of an energy crisis in Australia. We have been for some time. Politicians are trying to make out that it's all under control. It's not under control.
Energy policy in Australia has become impossible.
We're in the midst of a transformation without a plan.
Unquestionably, power prices in Australia are too high.
I love you.
I love you too.
You know, I think to live in Sydney these days comfortably, you need to be on a six-figure salary.
Hiya.
David Boyd is on a part-time wage. His power bill is due. After rent, he's left with just $300 a fortnight to cover food, bills and medical expenses.
I don't know where I can make any more cuts. If it goes up any more, it's going to knock me out. I'll be insolvent.
Daddy, can we try and find the Harry Potter book so we can read it?
He has no car or phone credit and needs charities to help him pay the bills.
That's the hardest part, is that I had a life of luxury at one time and now it's the ultimate galling experience. And so I've had to learn to swallow my pride and basically go begging for my existence. It's the hardest thing, and you know, it's brought me to tears many times.
For a man with very little, David Boyd is paying for a lot. His electricity bill is vastly more expensive than it was a decade ago. Not only does he pay for what he uses, he's also slugged for his retailer to read his meter and send him his bill, as well as for the upkeep of poles and wires. And things look like they'll just get harder. But David Boyd has been paying hundreds of dollars he should never have had to. 7:30 can reveal new research that's uncovered alleged price gouging by Australia's biggest power companies. And it all starts at Hazelwood. This was one of Australia's oldest and dirtiest brown coal mines. Now, in an effort that's costing hundreds of millions of dollars, the mine is being cleaned up. The power station will soon be demolished. We're being allowed inside.
Globally, the world is transitioning away from brown coal, and so this is one of the biggest power stations at the moment that is being decommissioned.
Hazelwood was built in the 1960s and privatised in 1996. It supplied about 20% of Victoria's electricity and about 5% of the power for the national grid. Despite the closure of coal-fired power stations in several states, 2/3 of Australia's electricity still comes from coal. This is a graph showing what's been powering Australia since 1990. As you can see, we've always been heavily reliant on black and brown coal. Even though wind and solar use is growing, 70% of our power still comes from coal. Before Hazelwood closed in 2017, the public was told power prices would increase. And they did. They skyrocketed.
Australia's households are paying amongst the highest price for electricity of any country in the world. It never used to be like this.
Researcher Bruce Mountain has spent 8 months analysing what happened to power prices when Hazelwood closed.
Level 13, going up.
He says when the closure was announced, the major power generator AGL effectively doubled the price of much of its output.
Coal generators collected an extra $3 billion in higher prices at the wholesale market. We think almost all of that was passed through to the consumer.
AGL's competition, the companies Origin and Energy Australia, increased their prices too.
We think AGL exercised market power. This is an industry that ultimately has gouged its customers.
The 9 million homes and businesses that rely on the national grid have paid the price.
We estimate around $200 per household per year is the impact of the exercise of market power. So they are paying roughly $200 more than they should, and that's ongoing.
Oh, I think companies were pricing excessively. The companies are allowed to do that under the rules. If people want to call that price gouging, I won't object to that. What we've got to try and stop is companies having market power in the first place.
Australia's national electricity market is highly concentrated. The big 3 companies control 70% of the retail market. At the same time, they produce almost half the electricity for the grid, giving them significant advantages over smaller players. The ACCC says AGL should never have been allowed to buy 2 coal-fired power stations in New South Wales because it feared there would be less competition.
It was what we were most concerned about. It's happened and it's cost Australian consumers a lot of money. So it is concerning, it is very frustrating.
Do you acknowledge that AGL put its prices up around that time?
I think all participants saw price go up following the announcement of the closure of Hazelwood. When a closure is announced, the market starts to price in that change.
Was AGL price gouging?
When people talk about price gouging, what they're really talking about is price going up. So price definitely went up following the closure of Hazelwood. AGL, being a large supplier of the market, was part of the beneficiary of that change. But it's meant that while pricing has gone up and that's provided more cash flow for us, we've also been ramping up what we've been investing in new supply.
Was Energy Australia price gouging after Hazelwood closed?
Energy Australia does not price gouge. Energy Australia is a responsible market operator who always offers our generation into the market in line with all the regulations and the way the market is to operate. When Hazelwood closed with no time to respond, the issue was not competition, the issue was the lack of supply. Take out a big generator with no replacement, you make supply and demand very tight, and it doesn't matter what your market structure is, you have no time to react and you get an energy price shock.
Was Origin engaged in price gouging?
No, Origin was not. In fact, there's been very forensic reviews by both the ACCC as well as the Grattan Institute, and it found no evidence. Origin has increased supply after Hazelwood closed by over 20%.
At the time, the regulator was asking questions.
With the short period of time that we had to conduct our review, we did not find evidence that generators were abusing their position to exercise market power.
But it didn't have the power to speak directly to energy companies.
Well, at the moment, our abilities are, in terms of information, are restricted.
Did that strike you as something of a ridiculous situation to be in?
Well, it struck me as somewhat frustrating.
Consumers are suffering badly. It's completely avoidable. This should never have happened to consumers. I think it's a shameful thing for Australia to have got to this position.
Careful. Yeah, you can have some.
The price increases have even been felt by middle-income families, like the Merrigans, who live southeast of Melbourne.
We look at cooking cheaper meals with cheaper meat. If we didn't, we wouldn't be able to pay our bills. That's kind of what it's come to.
With Corinne studying, they're living on Dave's income and worrying about what they spend.
Constantly looking at your finances.
Always, every week.
And when you're working so hard, like so many hours, and you're still grinding the numbers at the end of the day, like.
We're earning good money as a family.
Yeah.
If Dave wasn't working his second and third jobs, we probably wouldn't be making it. Show me how good you can brush your teeth. Which one?
One of their biggest costs is their power bill, at $50 a week.
The last few quarters I've opened the power bill, my stomach has literally gone up because I thought, oh my goodness, how am I using this much power?
They've had to make some changes.
I'm thinking about the switches I'm turning off when I'm not here, so the toaster, things I never have thought about before. Power bills have increased dramatically. The last 6 months in particular, we've really noticed a sting on our bill, whereas 5 years ago it was a lot more affordable.
In the last financial year, almost 128,000 Australians had their power cut off because they couldn't pay their bills. Victorians were the worst affected, with close to 34,000 people disconnected, up more than 18%. It was a similar story in New South Wales, where more than 32,000 electricity users were left in the dark. Tens of thousands of customers were also affected in Queensland and Western Australia.
We worry a lot about disconnections because any disconnection obviously isn't a great result for the consumer or for the business.
What we've found raises very profound questions for the design and operation and oversight of the market. I think the failure is so significant that it justifies a no-holds-barred, serious, independent rethink of this electricity market.
Currently, we are really struggling to get our savings up because of our everyday costs, including power, and mainly power, to be honest. That's our biggest bill at the moment, our biggest cost of living. We're an average family of 5, and we're really feeling the pressure of these increases every year.
And tomorrow night, we'll bring you the second part of our power special on solar energy.
Australia has the most solar energy of any continent in the world.
Be very careful that you're not just a pawn in their way of making a lot of money.
Australia's energy problems were front of mind for the Morrison government today. It announced a dozen projects earmarked for federal money, including gas, hydro and an upgrade to a coal-fired power station. While the political debate around energy shifts back and forth, around 2 million homes and businesses have made the switch to rooftop solar. But the money flowing into renewables, some of it from government subsidies, has meant a rush of new players in the market and some very unhappy consumers. This story by Liz Hobday with production by Chris Gillette and Danny Tran.
Retiree Trevor Pratt is the most connected man in his neighbourhood.
I've got 28 solar panels. I've got 2 batteries, Tesla batteries, and I drive a Tesla car. Solar energy is going to be there till we all die.
Even driving at night, his car is powered by the sun.
Australia has the most solar energy of any continent in the world. It's got equivalent, if not better, than the Sahara Desert.
He invested $40,000 on a solar and battery setup to eliminate future bills.
Hi, Liz. Come on in.
Thank you.
My bill's zero. I get a plus in the summer and it's zero through the winter.
How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel that it's using the technology the way it's supposed to be used.
Are you happy with the money you've spent?
Yes, very. Depending on pricing, it could be a 6-year payback. After that, it's all free.
Now to Tasmania's weather. There's a total fire ban for Greater Hobart, the southeast. Launceston, hot and mostly sunny. It's 32, 9 above average. Hobart, very hot and sunny.
If you're born on the land, I think it's always in you because there is an incredible freedom and there's an incredible opportunity.
Sixth-generation farmer Roderick O'Connor is feeling the heat. So now he's trying to harness the sun. He recently installed 200 solar panels to try to lower his power bills and reduce his carbon emissions.
Basically made the decision to go solar farming in around about August last year. I can't see power prices reducing. We think we're saving around about 50% of current prices on just this system alone. It's going to reduce my power bills on this particular site by around about $7,000 a year.
His solar system is being used to power irrigation pumps, and it's already halved his electricity use.
We've changed the way we farm and we're changing the way we try and look at costs so we can actually run a viable business into the future.
This is a graph showing what's been powering Australia since 1990. As you can see, we've always been heavily reliant on black and brown coal.
There are two problems. One is that the prices keep going up, and second, that there's increased risk of blackouts. We need to be replacing the ageing coal generators as they leave the market, and we can't replace them with coal, so what are we going to use?
Australia has the highest uptake of rooftop solar per household in the world. Overall, renewables have been shown to reduce the price of power, while solar systems give households more control over their energy bills.
I think a lot of people are doing it because they feel like they really want to just take control of them themselves because they don't feel like governments are looking after them.
The average solar household saves more than $500 a year. But the renewables industry has been kick-started by government subsidies, for which each household is paying, on average, more than $100 a year.
There's a subsidy now being paid by people who don't have rooftop solar, and it's just not necessary anymore. So there's just no reason now to get people who don't have rooftop solar to pay for your rooftop solar.
Anything that is government subsidised opens the door for people or companies who want to make a dollar out of the system. So be very careful that you're not just a pawn in their way of making a lot of money.
For those Australians who've decided to install solar panels, the sun doesn't always shine.
The dent it's made has not been worthwhile. I think possibly after about 20 years we might get our money back.
This solar system in Brisbane's west cost Alex Smith $9,000 back in 2012.
It became obvious very quickly that it was not delivering anywhere near the sort of return that a 3 kilowatt system should return. The efficiency of the system was nowhere near what I was told it would be, and the returns were very disappointing.
The panels were placed on a shed roof, partly shaded by trees.
I expected somebody to come out here and physically inspect the site and say whether it was suitable or not. But the way they did it was just simply to look at an aerial satellite photo of the property.
He says a vital part, the system's inverter, has failed 3 times. Each time, it's had to be replaced.
The message from me that may help others is do your homework before you install solar. Your home or your roof or the angle of your house might not be right.
Solar panels should last for decades, but the market's been flooded by cheap and substandard products. 7:30 can reveal new data from the Consumer Action Law Centre shows Australians are increasingly being burned by solar. At least 700 solar companies have gone out of business in the last 8 years, and it's left an estimated 650,000 consumers as so-called solar orphans, many with worthless warranties.
You just saw this swarm of people come into a market where you actually didn't have many people in the market, so a whole lot of new players came in, and that's always a bit of a worry.
Investors in renewables have long been asking for long-term policy stability and infrastructure upgrades.
When we think about the building that we need to do, it needs long-term certainty to get it right and to get the infrastructure that we need to do right. But the political reaction, if you like, is simply a symptom of how the community's feeling. The community is really worried. We hear that worry and we listen to it.
But renewables themselves are not problem-free.
Solar panels generally have a 25-year warranty. We're seeing a lot of panels that were installed, say, 8 or 9 years ago that are coming off roofs at the moment.
Most are destined for landfill. This facility in South Australia is the only site in the country that's dedicated to dealing with solar panel waste, and it's nowhere near keeping up with demand.
We're doing approximately about 500 to 600 a day.
The panels are stripped down to their components and the materials separated for reuse.
Because it's an emerging issue that's not really looked at.
Sooner or later, about 1 million tonnes of solar panels will end up on the scrap heap. But it's a problem Australians have largely ignored.
So it's a bit like something that's growing underneath their feet. That's potentially going to be a huge problem if it's not handled properly. And what it could mean potentially is a huge landfill issue.
We're in the midst of a transformation without a plan, and that's the problem. So we know we have to change the way we produce electricity in Australia. We're not quite clear on what that looks like into the future. And that anxiety is driving governments to step in and take all manner of steps to try and be seen to be remedying it, bring down power prices, create a sense of certainty. But there is a lack of a national plan to execute a change in the electricity supply.
And we've invited the relevant Minister Angus Taylor to join us to discuss the government's energy policies tomorrow after the third and final part of our Power series. As Australia gets hotter and power prices increase, parts of our national grid are seeing longer and more frequent blackouts. Australia is still very dependent on coal to keep the grid running. This week, the Morrison government was looking at various new energy projects, including coal, even as our biggest energy companies complain that a lack of consistent policy on energy and climate change are hindering investment. So what will Australia's energy future look like, and how long do we have to get there? This story by Liz Hobday and producers Chris Gillette and Danny Tran.
Might be a bit wide. No? Oh, I can still get around there. Hey, lovely bowl.
It's 36 degrees at Frankston Bowls Club in Victoria. Like so many Australians, over time, these keen bowlers have changed the way they live.
I think we're saving power if we're using the bowling club's power.
They're trying to cope with the heat and the cost of power.
It's just going up and up. Didn't get my air conditioner replaced because it was just too expensive to run anyway.
They believe that in the future, these problems will only intensify.
How will the grandchildren be in a few years? Yeah.
But the future, I don't know what's going to happen.
Across the country, power prices have soared. Last year, Australia's 3 biggest power companies posted huge profits.
Over the last 10 years or so, after inflation, power prices have gone up by 56%. For some households, they would have doubled after inflation. So this is a huge increase for people.
We're doing everything we can to lower price. The best way we can do that is to invest in new generation. Today, we have something like $1.9 billion worth of projects under development. Our profits are high, I want to acknowledge that, but what we're spending is even higher in terms of moving ourselves and moving the country into that new generation future.
We'd love to have an integrated energy and climate policy that gave confidence for investment. So yes, it is frustrating to see a carbon scheme come and go, particularly when it then completely changes investment plans. And when those investment plans change, some of those investments don't happen.
Despite the uncertainty, money has still been flowing into renewables. Commercial investment in the sector hit a record $20 billion last year. Cameron Stowe left his job at a car plant to manage a wind farm in Western Victoria.
We generate around about 650 gigawatt hours per year.
Today, he's supervising workers, inspecting one of the turbines.
It powers about 120,000 average size homes. Australia is a sensational place for renewables. This is our stop.
These turbines produce huge amounts of power, but that's only when the wind is blowing. The amount of electricity produced for the national grid by wind farms like this one hit an all-time high last month. But wind still only makes up about 5% of the energy fuelling the national grid.
I was still very dependent on coal. It's still the largest source of electricity generation in Australia.
We have an abundance of sun, wind and natural resources. And some of the coal-fired power stations, they are ageing now and we do need to replace them. But what we do need is clear policy settings to allow us to replace them.
How much longer does coal have left in Australia?
I think it's got till about 2050. I think if we're closing down by 2050, I think the market's moved beyond coal by about then.
While the politics around energy and climate change plays out and Australia transitions to renewables, longer and hotter summers are putting more pressure on the system right now.
The national grid is not a very stable structure as it stands. It's very hard to fix up a system that is falling apart.
In New South Wales and South Australia, power outages are happening more often and lasting longer, while in Queensland, cyclones have meant extended blackouts.
During heat waves this summer, we noted that without strong winds or without the sun shining on given days, we were under supply for generation. And what we're really facing is how we run the grid, accepting that wind and solar are a critical part of the generation mix, and how we adjust better for those conditions because they're going to keep coming into the future.
When blackouts do happen, they can be catastrophic.
There are official warnings of electricity blackouts.
When the power goes out, we notice the lights flicker, the computers turn off and on, and we all know we've gone onto generator backup.
Scores of businesses shut down for hours during a peak hour blackout.
It was 44 degrees. All of the power went off. I then waited to speak to an operator to explain that we were a childcare centre, to which we were told there was nothing they could do.
When a blackout cut power for about 4 hours.
Last year we lost power approximately 25 to 30 times. And if we've got baby koalas in humidity cribs, then we have to worry about hot water bottles, maintaining the temperature.
Thousands of homes have been plunged into darkness.
Ryan is affected by Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and as a consequence,
full-time ventilation. That's 24/7. So reliable power is absolutely paramount to sustain his life.
So how are we going to stabilise the grid and keep the lights on? After South Australia's statewide blackouts in 2016, the company Tesla installed a massive battery system north of Adelaide. It stabilised supply and brought prices down by dispatching electricity quickly just when it's needed.
Batteries will play an important part both in a large scale but also in people's houses.
Grid stability depends on both generation and a functioning system of poles and wires. It may also come to depend on storage like this.
And what this system does is it takes solar electricity from solar panels and water, just from a normal tap water source. It splits the water into hydrogen and oxygen.
At the CSIRO in Melbourne, power from the sun is being used to split water molecules and collect and then store the resulting hydrogen gas.
You can then take that hydrogen and convert it back into electricity through a fuel cell. That process would then allow you to completely eliminate the use of fossil fuels.
So it's elegant in its simplicity. The question is, of course, can you make that work at scale and how much does it cost?
The technology can also be used in other ways. Car makers are trialling hydrogen-powered cars. Instead of exhaust, these cars produce water.
I think this country has the potential to return to being that big domestic energy superpower that it's been in the past off the back of coal. We can do that in the future off the back of renewables, because suddenly you can export renewable energy if you convert it to hydrogen.
A national hydrogen plan is under development, and there's talk of export markets in Japan and South Korea.
What we're seeing is rapid change. I'm talking months, not decades as it used to be.
We're really at the point now where the idea that we can replace coal with coal is over. That's gone. And the debate we should be having is, what does our grid look like in the 21st century?
And a short time ago, the Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, joined me from Adelaide. Mr Taylor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Lou.
The Prime Minister's announced a feasibility study looking at a coal plant in North Queensland. If nobody in the private sector wants to build a coal plant in that region, why does it make sense for the Morrison government to use taxpayer money to do it?
Well, Lee, as you would know, the ACCC recommended last year that we get more supply into the market, more competition into the market. They made this recommendation because many of our electricity markets aren't functioning as they should. They're not competitive enough. The ACCC recommended that that be technology neutral. It should be neutral to the energy source or the fuel source. So we went out, asked for 66 proposals. Asked for proposals, we received 66. We've shortlisted 12 and we've said we've got a very specific problem we have to solve in Queensland, which is how to make sure we've got enough affordable, reliable power to keep the jobs in Queensland that are driven around energy-intensive heavy industry.
You've said that, you have to have more supply and competition and it should be neutral in regards to the fuel source. The Australian Energy Market Operator has warned that a coal plant in the region you're looking at is unlikely to be efficient due to network congestion, that Queensland has a negligible risk of power supply shortfalls in the next decade, and that it's one of the sunniest places in the country, so it lends itself well to solar project investment. Why are you overlooking all of that from the experts?
Well, because there's a problem with competition and an emerging problem with supply in Queensland. The truth of the matter is that we have seen the Queensland market has acted in a very uncompetitive way, to a large degree because the government, which owns most of the energy assets up there, have encouraged it. They've been using their energy sector in Queensland as a piggy bank, as a cash cow. Now, we need to see more competition. Your program earlier this week showed what can happen if you don't have enough competition in the market, and Queensland is one of the markets where we need to see
the question's the best way of doing it, and I outlined that list of reasons there why the energy market operator didn't see a coal plant as the best way to do it. The market would back that in by the fact that there aren't any private investors looking to do it up there.
Well, Lee, private investors are very nervous to go into markets which are all tied up by existing incumbents. That's why we've got challenges in South Australia. It's why we've got challenges in Queensland. We need more competition, and this is exactly why the ACCC recommended that we encourage new supply and new competition into the marketplace. Look, we have businesses in Queensland, whether it's in agriculture or aluminium or other energy-intensive industry, which will simply leave the country. The jobs will go offshore, and global emissions will go up because they are relatively efficient industries.
Is this North Queensland option less about sound policy and more about sandbagging the Queensland LNP from One Nation and others come the federal election?
Absolutely not. I mean, look, the prices being paid for electricity in Central and North Queensland are simply too high. I've spent an enormous amount of time there in recent months. If we talk to the irrigators, if you talk to the heavy industry in towns like Gladstone or Bundaberg, quite simply, if this problem is not solved soon, we will lose those jobs.
AGL predicts that coal should be finished in Australia by 2050. When does the Morrison government see the tipping point for Australia relying more on renewable energy sources than coal for its power needs?
Well, you know, Lee, I've been around in business a long while, and predicting out to 2050 is a pretty brave thing to do. But
well, that's
what
why
is
I'm asking, what's the Morrison government's projection on that?
Well, there's a transition happening.
And
there's no question about it. And we're seeing well over $20 billion of investment in renewable, in solar and wind in the coming 3 years.
But if I can just try to pin you down, because it's a pretty straightforward question and it's a pretty basic one really that would drive a lot of policy. When do you see that transition where you've shifted from, say, 70% reliance on coal to 50% and less reliance on coal? When do you see, what's the time frame you see over that happening?
It's happening now. I mean, we're seeing very significant investment in solar and wind happening right now.
And when would you predict that hitting a tipping point of more than 50% of our power needs?
You know, Lee, this is not about central planning. This is actually about leveraging technologies which are becoming more competitive, are becoming more successful, and making sure we've got the supporting investment happening around it. Now, an example of that is the $1.4 billion we're investing in Snowy Hydro to make sure when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, that we've got the supply we need in the marketplace to keep the lights on and to keep prices down. So this transition is happening naturally, but it's got to be happening in a way where we do keep a focus on those crucial issues of maintaining jobs, making sure prices are affordable and keeping the lights on.